Now, in our final part 4 of our Lecture 1 video presentations, I'll go through the six types of contingency relationships most commonly discussed in contingency theory. I'll talk you through these relationships, how these arrows or ideas follow each other, and broadly describe to you how contingent models might manifest. So we know that contingencies might relate to structures and that might then affect performance. But how do contingencies relate to each other and structures, and how does that then affect performance? There are different patterns or different observations we might note in observing how contingent relationships and structures lead to performance. And that is really the point of showing you these 6 causal models. The first is the additive causal model contingent form. With the additive form, each individual independent variable, so independent variables, much like in mathematics and statistics, affect a dependent variable. Independent variables separately and individually affect a dependent variable. They don't affect each other. They affect the dependent variable separately and individually. For example, if we think about the Wimbledon Lawn Tennis Championships, Wimbledon, staff customer service might be one independent variable, and player performance might be another independent variable. Independent variables for what? For customer satisfaction or tennis fans' satisfaction. That is our dependent variable. So the better the customer service fans get at Wimbledon, the better players play, the happier the customer. That's the story. X1, X2, and Y. But we know that customer service does not necessarily make Roger Federer hit the tennis ball better. So player performance doesn't go up if fans get better customer service, if customer service is higher. Similarly, customer service doesn't improve because player performance improves. Folks selling jam and scones or at the bar don't necessarily work better or offer better service because Roger Federer happens to be hitting the tennis ball better today. So separately they affect customer satisfaction, fan satisfaction, but they don't interact to affect fan satisfaction. Though it's clear that if both happen, fans will be happier, they don't work with each other to make it happen. We define that as an additive form relationship. X1 affects Y, X2 affects Y, but X1 and X2 don't really work together to affect Y. They affect Y separately. The intervening form is the second type of contingent variable form. Here, the effect of an independent variable impacts another independent variable, and that then impacts the final dependent variable. So X1 might affect Y through X2 and not on its own. Without X2, X1 might not be able to affect Y. For example, a university professor, X1, say the teaching quality of a university professor, it might be X1. The professor wishes to, or ultimately create ethical corporate practice. That's why. That's the outcome, ethical corporate practice. But the professor doesn't go out to industry and give speeches. He or she doesn't go and give speeches directly to industry. They simply try to affect ethical corporate practice by teaching their students ethics in organizations. So X2 might be student understanding of ethical conduct, or the ethical conduct, or the importance of ethical conduct. So professor teaching quality on ethics is X1. X2 is student understanding of ethics, or the importance of ethical conduct. And Y is the practice of ethics in corporate society, ethical corporate practice. Here, X1, if professors teach ethics well, students increase their awareness and sense of importance of ethics, and that then eventually affects corporate society and our appreciation of ethical conduct. The professor doesn't go out to industry and do it him or herself. He or she only does it through students. That is the intervening form. X1 does not affect Y of its own. It only affects Y through X2. And that characterizes an intervening form. The third form is the independent variable interaction form. Here, how much one independent variable x1 affects a dependent variable y is really dependent, conditional, on another independent variable. So x1 can affect y by itself, but it can also, its effect on y can also be impacted by x2. So x2 can affect the relationship between x1 and y. Now you'll recall, in our first form, additive form, x1 affected y with no intervention from x2. x2 affected y with no intervention from x1. But in this third form, there is an interaction. So that third form shows as follows. I want to show you the image before talking you through an example. So x1 can affect y separately, but also through x2. x2 affects the way x1 impacts y. x2 doesn't affect x1. x2 affects the way x1, whatever it is, affects y. And x1 can't affect how high or low x2 is, but x1 can affect how x2 impacts y. Let's use an example. The quality of a dance. If y is the quality of a dance, we're in a dance school. The quality of a dance, y, the dependent variable, depends on two independent variables, let's say. Number one is a very extrinsic reward, the money we pay dancers to dance, so the reward for performing, x1, and x2, the ability of a dancer, so how good a dancer is to begin with. So the better the quality of your dancers, the more the reward you give them, the higher the quality of the dance they produce. We know that a higher reward for performing will strengthen the relationship between the ability of the dancer and the quality of the dance. So if this is higher, it will probably increase the likelihood that any dancer with a certain set of ability, it doesn't make a dancer more capable, but it makes it perhaps more likely that the dancer will focus because the dancer wants that higher reward and therefore produce a high quality performance. It's not that ability increases, it's that perhaps your focus increases and therefore you're motivated by that money and you do better. It could be the reverse, because you're given a financial incentive, the artistic side of you goes away and you think more transactionally, and you may not dance as well because it's an artistic thing and you lose that artistic flair. But the reward affects the way your ability translates to performance. It doesn't make you more or less able, but it affects how your ability relates to performance. Similarly, we might argue that the ability of a reward to affect performance really depends on how good the dancer is to begin with. If you've got a terrible dancer, it doesn't matter how much you pay him or her, it's not going to lead to a good dance because the dancer isn't of quality to begin with. So the quality of the dancer can affect how well rewards impact the quality of a dance. So x1 and x2 don't just separately affect y, they affect y by interacting with one another to then affect y. The fourth relationship is the moderator variable interaction form. Here, the relationship between x and y is affected by a moderator variable. Now, why don't we call the moderator variable x2? Why do we say moderator variable? We call it moderator variable because the moderator variable is unaffected by x or y. And the moderator variable, all it does really is affect the relationship between an x and a y. It doesn't specifically affect x or affect y, it affects how x links to y. So I'll give you an example. The probability that spectators will be satisfied in the Wimbledon Tennis Championships, the lawn tennis tournament, is strongly contingent on the weather. So the weather will explain how satisfied perhaps a spectator is at Wimbledon. Perhaps when it's a beautiful sunny day, the spectators might naturally be more inclined to be satisfied because it's a beautiful day, the sun's shining, everyone's naturally more positively dispositioned. But if it was a gloomy, cloudy day, you're kind of sitting there and you're waiting for the game to start, or the weather's a bit cold and you've got your jumper on and you're kind of shivering a bit, and you just enjoy it a little less. It's not that your satisfaction is higher or lower just because of the weather. It could be that the way your satisfaction is driven by the events of the Wimbledon lawn tennis tournament is impacted by the weather, and therefore your satisfaction accordingly impacts the success of the Wimbledon lawn tennis tournament differently. So in a moderator variable relationship, how happy you are or how successful the Wimbledon lawn tennis tournament is doesn't affect whether it's going to rain or not. The rain's going to come whether it comes. The rain's going to come when it comes. You being happier or less happy will not cause the rain to come or go away. But the way it affects, for it to be a moderator variable, the way it affects the success of the championships and customer satisfaction, fan satisfaction, in this instance, in this specific example, is not by making the tournament more successful, but by saying however successful or not the tournament, your satisfaction would have been greater if it was a sunny day versus if it was a cloudy day, because the success of the tournament doesn't explain the full spectrum of your experience perhaps, and the weather does have some impact in how it translates and how the successful tournament translates to your satisfaction, as I said before. And a moderator variable interaction shows as follows. So you can see here a wide range of ways in which variables might interact. Let's go to the fifth relation. The cyclical recursive relation is when x1 today affects the value of x2 tomorrow. And we might call that x2 t plus 1, sometime in the future, t being time. x2 changing then affects x1 in the future, x1 t plus 3, which then affects x2 t plus 4, etc. So what I do to x1 today affects x2 in the future, x2 then affects x1 in the future, x1 being different affects x2 again, and we keep going forward. Cyclical recursive. A very simple example to illustrate this. Marketing expenditures today might impact sales tomorrow. With more sales, you can market even more. With more marketing, you get even more sales. So one reinforces the other. We call that a cyclical recursive relation. The final relation is the reciprocal non-recursive relation. Here we observe a relationship where causality between x1 and x2 are difficult to distinguish. So we don't have a y, we don't have a dependent, because we're not even sure if what's dependent on what. It's almost that chicken or the egg type example. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say we're looking at the trust between a supplier and a customer and the profits of both organizations. So trust is one and profit's the other. Now, does trust between supplier and customer cause profit? Or do profitable firms naturally trust each other more because they are profitable and are probably going to be good for their transactions made? Which comes first? Now, it could be both. If you're a manager that picks your suppliers or your customers because they're profitable and you therefore trust what they do, well, then profit leads to trust. But if you're a company that builds a relationship from the ground up with a supplier and you then trust them, and you then engage in profitable operations with them, once the trust comes about, you might then say that trust leads to profitable outcomes. So really it could be a bit of both, and that visually shows as follows. So consider all those different relationships I just showed you for how independent variables can lead to dependent variables. One of the things I really like about this subject, and I'll talk about this more face-to-face in Lecture 2 when I see you in the LSE, I really like how we quite thoughtfully prosecute how it is that things actually happen. We don't just say one leads to another leads to another. That's intervening. There's a whole bunch of different other different ways things can lead to one another. So you generally develop a very coherent and strong analytical ability as a result of engaging in this module. But taking a step back, I'd like to emphasize we've engaged in a contingency theory discussion, but this module more broadly, the 5 lectures, are on accounting and human behavior. It's not a contingency theory module. Contingency theory is just one lens to look at accounting and human behavior. I use it as a framework, contingency theory as a framework to explain to you the complexities underlying what motivates human behavior and how we might use accounting systems to affect human behavior. Let it allow you to better appreciate this complexity around how accounting might be constructed, how it affects individuals in organizations. But this is not a contingency theory module of its own. Now, a reminder for your tutorial exercise relating to our lecture released today, Friday, Jan 12th. Our tutorial will be covered next week when I see you face to face on Friday, 19 Jan. I'll ask you to complete the following tasks. 1, to identify one contingency relationship other than the range of examples we've discussed. You may extract it from your 3 readings. It need not be organization size, environment, strategy. Think of anything, how things relate, try and draw arrows, and we'll talk about them in class when we meet. Think about the contingency, think about the structure and the outcome variable. You know, don't even get caught up in those labels. If you're struggling to think of a structure, well, just think of how things might relate to one another and how it depends. When one thing's high, another thing might result. When one thing's low, a different thing results. Think about those contingent possibilities. Is that relation additive? Is it interactive? Is it moderating, intervening? Is it a combination of both, of a few? Cyclical, recursive, reciprocal, non-recursive? I want you to think about that. Identify a real-world interrelation and try and think about how you might draw it. So you really want to think how they link. We'll then discuss how the assumptions of rationality that underline contingency relationships might be broken by ideas of politicization, power broking, or any other factor discussed in the lecture today. Population ecology was one I discussed in that part of the lecture discussion. But otherwise, thank you for listening so intently over the 4 videos, the 4 parts. I'm sorry we had to break it up just for purposes of uploading on YouTube. Each presentation has to be less than 20 minutes. I do look forward to seeing you in the lectures and tutorials next Friday, and I wish you a very safe and enjoyable week ahead. See you very soon.